In an emmetropic eye, if object is at 6 meter or infinity, then the light rays coming from that object focus in the retina. But if the object is brought closer than 6 meter, our eyes needs more converging power to focus on the retina. Accommodation is the mechanism through which our eyes increase the converging power to focus on the retina when object is closer than 6 meters. So, accommodation is the mechanism by which the eye changes refractive power by altering the shape of the lens in order to focus objects at variable distance. At rest, the radius of curvature of anterior surface of lens is 10 mm and that of posterior surface is 6 mm. During accommodation, the curvature of posterior surface remains almost the same, but radius of anterior surface changes to 6 mm. Now let's see what are the components of accommodation. Far point. Far point is a position of an object when its image clearly falls on retina with no accommodation. 6 meter to infinity is considered as far point. Near point of accommodation. The nearest point clearly seen with maximum accommodation is called near point. The near point of accommodation varies with the age. Range of accommodation. The distance between the far point and near point is called the range of accommodation. Now, amplitude of accommodation. The difference between the dioptric power needed to focus at near point P and the far point R is called amplitude of accommodation. The formula is A is equal to P minus R. Here A is equal to amplitude of accommodation, P is equal to accommodation at near point, R is equal to accommodation at far point. In a specific distance, amplitude of accommodation can be identified by using the formula 100 divided by D. Here D is equal to distance in centimeter. Let's understand this with an example. If we want to identify amplitude of accommodation at 40 centimeter, then according to formula, the amplitude of accommodation should be 100 divided by 40 or 2.5 diopter. Mechanism of accommodation. According to von Helmholtz theory, when the eye is at rest, the ciliary ring is large and keeps the zonule tense, due to which the lens is kept compressed or flat by the capsule. Contraction of ciliary muscles causes the ciliary ring to shorten and thus releases zonular tension on the lens capsule. This allows the elastic capsule to deform the lens substances, ultimately changes the shape of the lens. The lens then alters its shape to become more convex. Types of accommodation. 1. Tonic accommodation. It is due to tonus of ciliary muscles and is active in absence of the stimulus. The resting state of accommodation is not at infinity but rather at an intermediate distance. 2. Proximal accommodation. It's induced by the awareness of the nearness of a target. This is independent of actual dioptric stimulus. 3. Reflex accommodation. It's an automatic adjustment response to blur which is made to maintain a clear and sharp retinal image. 4. Convergence accommodation. Amount of accommodation stimulated or relaxed associated with convergence. The link between accommodation and convergence is known as accommodative convergence and is expressed clinically as AC by A ratio. Stimulus and response of accommodation. Stimulus of accommodation. Blur image, apparent size and distance of object, chromatic aberrations, scanning movements of eyes. Reaction time of accommodation. It refers to the time between the presentation of accommodative stimulus and occurrence of accommodative response. Reaction time of accommodation from far to near is 0.64 seconds, and from near to far 0.56 seconds. Pathway of accommodation. Afferent pathway. Afferent pathway means traveling of stimulus towards the brain. When accommodative stimulus reaches to retina, the stimulus travels through the visual pathway and reaches to primary visual cortex in the brain. Efferent pathway. Efferent pathway is the traveling of signals from the brain towards the organ. From the parasympathetic oculomotor nuclei, the signal sends to oculomotor nerve, that is third nerve. Then from the third nerve, signal reaches to ciliary ganglion. Then from the ciliary ganglion, the signals reach to short ciliary nerve, and from the short ciliary nerve, the signal reaches to sphincter pupillae and ciliary muscles. When signal reached to ciliary muscles contract, due to which geniole get relaxed and lens accommodate. Now, anomalies of accommodation. Anomalies of accommodation can be of two types. In one type, accommodative response is more than accommodative stimulus, and in other type, accommodative response is less than the accommodative stimulus. Diminished accommodation, insufficiency of accommodation, ill-sustained accommodation, inertia of accommodation, paralysis of accommodation. In this type of anomalies of accommodation, the accommodative response is less than the accommodative stimulus. Increased accommodation, excessive accommodation, spasm of accommodation. In this type of anomalies of accommodation, the accommodative response is more than the accommodative stimulus. Accommodation and its different formula in clinical practice. I will discuss about how to calculate amplitude of accommodation, how to find amplitude of accommodation from near point of accommodation, how to find required accommodation at any specific given distance, and Hofstadter's formula for maximum, normal, and minimum amplitude of accommodation in particular age. We all know that in an emmetropic eye, rays coming from infinity focus on the retina and we see the object clearly. Now, if the object bring closer to the eyes, the divergence of rays from the object increases. Rays become more divergent. If our eyes would have a fixed power, then rays will focus behind the retina and we would see the object blur. But nature has given us a such precious mechanism, that is accommodation, through which eyes can change the shape of crystalline lens to increase the converging power of our eye, and we can see clearly object in closer distance also. But our accommodation has a limit, means it can increase our eyes converging power at a certain limit, which is called amplitude of accommodation. At young age, amplitude of accommodation is higher, and with age increasing, amplitude of accommodation gradually decreases. Now, as amplitude of accommodation decreases with age, so there must be a normal value of amplitude of accommodation for specific age. If we can identify someone's amplitude of accommodation, then we can match with the normal value and identify whether he or she is having normal accommodative response or not. So, there are two things we need to identify. One, how to identify actual amplitude of accommodation of the patient. 2. How to find normal value of amplitude of accommodation for a specific age. Let's see how to identify actual amplitude of accommodation of the patient. Several methods are there, but easiest method is identify the near point of accommodation in centimeter, then use the formula amplitude of accommodation equal to 100 divided by near point of accommodation in centimeter. Let's see how to identify near point of accommodation. Ask the patient to sit comfortably with his or her correction. Then ask the patient to fixate at any size letters or word at arm distance, that is 50 to 100 cm. Then slowly take the target towards the patient until patient reports first sustained or persistent blur. Now measure the distance with a centimeter scale from the eye to the target, that is near point of accommodation. Let's see an example. While performing near point of accommodation procedure, a patient reports sustained blur at 11 cm. What is amplitude of accommodation of this patient? According to formula, amplitude of accommodation equal to 100 divided by near point of accommodation in centimeter, or amplitude of accommodation equal to 100 divided by 11, or amplitude of accommodation is 9.09 or 9 diopter. Now let's see how to find normal value of amplitude of accommodation for a specific age. To find out amplitude of accommodation for a specific age, we can use Hofstadter's formula. Hofstadter's formula helps us to identify maximum, minimum and normal value of amplitude of accommodation for a specific age. The maximum amplitude of accommodation for a specific age equal to 25 minus 0.4 multiplied by age. Expected normal amplitude of accommodation for a specific age equal to 18.5 minus 0.3 multiplied by age. Minimum amplitude of accommodation for a specific age equal to 15 minus 0.25 multiplied by age. For example, what will be the maximum expected and minimum amplitude of accommodation of a 20 years old patient? According to Hofstadter's formula, maximum amplitude of accommodation will be 25 minus 0.4 multiplied by 20 or 17 diopter, and expected normal amplitude of accommodation will be 18.5 minus 0.3 multiplied by 20 or 12.5 diopter, and minimum amplitude of accommodation will be 15 minus 0.25 multiplied by 20 or 10 diopter. So a 20 years old patient can have maximum amplitude of accommodation 17 diopter, expected or normal amplitude of accommodation around 12.5 diopter, and minimum amplitude of accommodation 10 diopter. Now we need different accommodative power at different distances. Closer the distance, higher the burdens of rays and higher the accommodation required. There is a formula through which we can identify accommodation required at any given distance. The formula is required accommodation equal to 100 divided by distance in centimeter. For example, to see clearly at 40 centimeter, how much our eyes will need to accommodate? According to above formula, accommodation required equal to 100 divided by distance in centimeter, or accommodation required equal to 100 divided by 40, or accommodation required equal to 2.5 diopter. So to see clearly at 40 centimeter, our eyes have to induce 2.5 diopter of accommodation. Let's see another example. A 25 years old patient has near point of accommodation 8 centimeter. Identify the actual amplitude of accommodation, expected amplitude of accommodation and final diagnosis. Actual amplitude of accommodation equal to 100 divided by near point of accommodation in centimeter, or actual amplitude of accommodation equal to 100 divided by 8, or actual amplitude of accommodation equal to 12.5 diopter. So actual amplitude of accommodation of this patient is 12.5 diopter. Now expected amplitude of accommodation for this age according to Hofstadter's formula. Expected amplitude of accommodation equal to 18.5 minus 0.3 multiplied by age, or expected amplitude of accommodation equal to 18.5 minus 7.5, or expected amplitude of accommodation is 11 diopter. Expected amplitude of accommodation at this age according to Hofstadter's formula is 11 diopter. So patient is having more than amplitude of accommodation than required at this age. So this patient may have accommodation excess. Now what is anomalies of accommodation? When our eyes are not able to produce required amount of accommodation, or may produce required amount of accommodation but can't maintain or facilitate as needed, is called accommodative anomalies. Anomalies of accommodation can be due to lower accommodation than the required, that is accommodative insufficiency, higher accommodation than required, that is accommodation excess, normal accommodation but not able to maintain for long, that is ill-sustained accommodation, accommodation can't facilitate at required distances, like accommodative infacility. The most common accommodative anomalies are accommodation insufficiency, ill-sustained accommodation, accommodation excess, and accommodation infacility. The 6 tests that allow us to identify these anomalies are 1. Amplitude of accommodation, 2. Near point of accommodation, 3. Negative relative accommodation, 4. Positive relative accommodation, 5. Accommodation facility, 6. Monocular estimated method. Now, outcome of those 6 tests that will help us to diagnose all these 4 accommodative anomalies. All these 6 tests helps us to identify 3 conditions of accommodative status. 1. Normal amplitude of accommodation, 2. Low amplitude of accommodation, 3. High amplitude of accommodation. 1. Normal amplitude of accommodation. When amplitude of accommodation is normal, there are 2 possibilities. A. There is no accommodative anomalies. B. Amplitude of accommodation is normal but not able to sustain for long period of time, that is called ill-sustained accommodation. 2. Low amplitude of accommodation. When amplitude of accommodation is low, there are 2 possibilities. A. Low amplitude of accommodation indicate that I can't exert required amount of accommodation that is required, and that is called accommodation insufficiency. B. Low amplitude of accommodation also indicate that I can't facilitate required accommodation at various distances, that is called accommodation infacility. 3. High amplitude of accommodation. High amplitude of accommodation indicate that I is exerting more accommodation than required, that is called accommodation excess. Now let's see the first 2 tests, amplitude of accommodation and near point of accommodation. For a specific age group, we can identify the amplitude of accommodation and then match with patient's amplitude of accommodation to identify whether the patient is having normal amplitude of accommodation, low amplitude of accommodation, or high amplitude of accommodation. Here are the Optometry formula to identify amplitude of accommodation for a specific age group. How to measure amplitude of accommodation? Amplitude of accommodation can simply measured by asking the patient to focus at a near target that is readable, then push the target closer to the patient till patient reports first sustained blur, that is near point of accommodation. Now measure the near point of accommodation, that is distance from the lateral canthus to the target, in centimeters. Then amplitude of accommodation can be identified by using the formula amplitude of accommodation equal to 100 divided by near point of accommodation in centimeter. Conclusion: first identify the patient's amplitude of accommodation and near point of accommodation, and then identify the normal value of amplitude of accommodation for this age group by using the Optometry formula to identify whether patient is having normal, low, or high amplitude of accommodation. Now negative relative accommodation and positive relative accommodation. NRA and PRA is performed in patient with full correction fixating at near readable target at 40 cm. When patient is fixating at 40 cm, plus lens is added in plus 0.25 diopter increment till target becomes sustained blur, that is called negative relative accommodation. When patient is fixating at 40 cm, minus lens is added in minus 0.25 diopter increment till target becomes sustained blur, that is called positive relative accommodation. Now at 40 cm, we need accommodation of 100 divided by 40 or 2.5 diopter to see any object. Patients with normal accommodative status will comfortably relax or induce accommodation of 2.5 diopter and will see the target clearly. But patients with accommodation excess will face difficulty in clearing plus lens, and NRA value will be less than the 2.5 diopter. And patients with accommodative insufficiency will face difficulty in clearing minus lens, and PRA value will be less than 2.5 diopter. So based on NRA and PRA value, low NRA indicate high amplitude of accommodation, low PRA indicate low amplitude of accommodation, and normal NRA and PRA indicate normal amplitude of accommodation. Now, accommodation facility test. In accommodation facility test, patient is asked to clear plus and minus lens of equal power one after another, while focusing at a near readable target. Patient with normal accommodative status will easily clear both plus and minus lens. They will complete more cycle in a minute. But patient with accommodation anomalies will take more time to clear either plus or minus lens, and they will complete less cycle per minute. Based on NRA and PRA value, difficulty in clearing plus lens, high amplitude of accommodation, difficulty in clearing minus lens, low amplitude of accommodation, and no difficulty in clearing plus and minus lens, that is normal amplitude of accommodation. Now, monocular estimated method. Monocular estimated method is performed with a strict retinoscope while patient is fully corrected and focusing at retinoscopic light or a readable target attached to the retinoscope. Then reflex is observed through the retinoscope. Patient with normal accommodative status, reflex will be neutral or slight with movement up to 0.75 diopter. Patient with accommodation excess, reflex will be against, that is low MEM value, and patient with accommodation insufficiency, reflex will be high with movement more than 0.75 diopter. Based on MEM value, very low MEM, that is accommodation excess or lead of accommodation, high MEM, that is accommodation insufficiency or lag of accommodation, and neutral to low MEM, that is normal accommodative status. Positive relative accommodation and negative relative accommodation. Positive relative accommodation and negative relative accommodation measure the maximum ability to stimulate accommodation while maintaining binocular single vision. NRA and PRA helps us to determine normal accommodative functions, accommodation excess, accommodation insufficiency, status of fusional convergence, status of fusional divergence, and determine refractive corrections. Now the question is, why it's called positive or negative relative accommodation? In positive relative accommodation, accommodation is stimulated with minus lens, that's why it's called positive relative accommodation. And in negative relative accommodation, accommodation is relaxed with plus lens, that's why it's called negative relative accommodation. So when accommodation is get stimulated or activated, it's called positive relative accommodation, and when accommodation get relaxed, then it's called negative relative accommodation. Now, what are the prerequisites for the test? Refractive status. Distance correction should be placed in the trial frame before starting the test. Room condition. Room condition should be daylight condition. Target, near vision chart or card. Fixation size. N6 target or last line easily read by the patient in near vision chart. Test distance 40 cm in front of the patient. Trial box will be needed positive and negative lenses. Trial frame. Now let's see how to measure positive relative accommodation. Ask the patient to sit comfortably and hold the near vision target at 40 cm. Patient fixate at the N6 target or the last line he or she can read comfortably. Now minus lenses are slowly added binocularly in 0.25 diopter steps until the patient reports first persistent blur. Here for this patient we have added minus 0.25 binocularly and patient is seeing the near target clearly. So we have to increase minus 0.25 diopter steps. So let's add minus 0.5 diopter. Still patient is seeing clear. Let's add more. With minus 0.75 still clear, let's add more. With minus 1 still clear, let's add more. With minus 1.25 still clear, let's add more. With minus 1.5 still clear, let's add more. Finally, with minus 1.75, patient is saying that there is a persistent blur. Remember, place the second lens in trial frame before removing the first lens. The power of minus trial lens required to make the target first persistent blur is the value of positive relative accommodation. So this 1.75 diopter will be positive relative accommodation value. Now, interpretation of positive relative accommodation test. Expected positive relative accommodation value is in between minus 1.5 diopter to minus 2.5 diopter. It will be normal accommodative function if positive relative value falls between minus 1.5 diopter to minus 2.5 diopter. It will be accommodation insufficiency if positive relative accommodation value is less than minus 1.5 diopter. It will be accommodation excess if positive relative accommodation value is more than minus 2.5 diopter. There will be inadequate functional divergence if positive relative accommodation value is less than minus 1.5 diopter. Because minus lenses in positive relative accommodation testing induces accommodation and increases accommodative convergence due to the AC by A link. In order to maintain clear binocular single vision, the eyes must neutralize the accommodative convergence by functional divergence response. Inadequate functional divergence can therefore limit the endpoint of positive relative accommodation measurement. Positive relative accommodation can also identify overcorrection in hyperopia and undercorrection in myopia. High positive relative accommodation value can be indicative of overcorrection in hypermetropia and undercorrection in myopia. You might be thinking, how does positive relative accommodation can identify overcorrection in hyperopia and undercorrection in myopia? Let's see in the next slide. In both conditions, overcorrection in hyperopia and undercorrection in myopia raise focus in front of the retina. To shift the rays in the retina, we need certain amount of diverging or minus power. This extra minus power will be added to the positive relative accommodation value, which results high positive relative accommodation value in overcorrected hyperopia and undercorrected myopia. So, if patient's accommodation response is normal but showing high positive relative accommodation value, then it indicates overcorrection in hypermetropia and undercorrection myopia is done during the refraction. Now, how to measure negative relative accommodation? Ask the patient to sit comfortably and hold the near vision target at 40 cm. Patient fixate at the N6 target or the last line he or she can read comfortably. Then plus lenses are slowly added binocularly in 0.25 diopter steps until patient reports first persistent blur. The power of plus trial lens required to make the target first persistent blur is the value of negative relative accommodation. Now, interpretation of negative relative accommodation test. Expected negative relative accommodation value is in between plus 1.75 diopter to plus 2.5 diopter. It will be normal accommodative function if negative relative accommodation value falls between plus 1.75 diopter to plus 2.5 diopter. It will be accommodation insufficiency if negative relative accommodation value is more than plus 2.5 diopter. It will be accommodation excess if negative relative accommodation value is less than plus 1.75 diopter. There will be inadequate functional convergence if negative relative value is less than plus 1.75 diopter. Because addition of plus lenses relaxes accommodation and stimulate divergence due to AC by A link. In order to maintain clear single binocular vision, the eyes converge or use functional convergence. Inadequate functional convergence therefore can reduce the end point of negative relative accommodation. Negative relative accommodation can identify overcorrection in myopia and undercorrection in hyperopia. High negative relative accommodation value can be indicative of overcorrection in myopia and undercorrection in hypermetropia. You might be thinking, how does negative relative accommodation can identify overcorrection in myopia and undercorrection in hyperopia? Let's see in the next slide. In both conditions, overcorrection in myopia and undercorrection in hyperopia rays focus behind the retina. To bring back the rays in the retina, we need certain amount of converging or plus power. This extra plus power will be added to the negative relative accommodation value, which results high negative relative accommodation value in overcorrected myopia and undercorrected hyperopia. So, if patient's accommodation response is normal but showing high negative relative accommodation value, then it indicates overcorrection in myopia and undercorrection in hyperopia is done during the refraction. How to measure amplitude of accommodation and near point of accommodation in minus lens method. Requirements: we need patient near vision chart and trial set. In the trial set, we will be needed trial frame, occluder and minus spherical trial lenses. Measuring amplitude of accommodation. Procedure: request the patient to sit comfortably. Ask the patient to wear the spectacle or other optical correction and occlude the left eye. The patient's attention is directed towards the best corrected near visual acuity target at 40 cm testing distance. The patient is asked to report the first sustained blur as minus lenses are added in front of the eye in 0.25 diopter steps. Suppose we have added 0.25 minus spherical trial lenses and patient is saying the target is clear. So we will increase minus 0.25 diopter more. So let's add 0.5. Patient is saying target is still clear. So now let's add minus 0.75. Still patient is saying it's clear. Let's add minus 1. Still it's clear. Now suppose the minus lenses added to report first sustained blur is minus 4 diopter. That means with the minus 4 diopter, the patient is able to appreciate the first sustained blur. Since the test is done at 40 cm distance, the stimulus to accommodation for that distance, that is 2.5 diopter spherical, should be numerically added to the resulting minus lens power to obtain the accommodative amplitude. So the final amplitude of accommodation will be 4 plus 2.5 or 6.5 diopter. Now occlude right eye and repeat the procedure for the left eye. How to identify near point of accommodation? The formula is NPA is equal to 100 divided by AOA. Here NPA is equal to near point of accommodation, AOA is equal to amplitude of accommodation. So NPA is equal to 100 divided by 6.5 or NPA is equal to 15.38 or 15 centimeter. Accommodation insufficiency. When amplitude of accommodation is lower than the expected for the patient age is called accommodation insufficiency. Suppose at the age of 18 years, patient's minimum amplitude of accommodation according to Obstetra formula is amplitude of accommodation equal to 15 minus 0.25 multiplied by age or 15 minus 0.2 multiplied by 18 or 15 minus 4.5 or 10.5 diopter. If a 18 years old patient has amplitude of accommodation of less than 10.5 diopter, then it may be a case of accommodation insufficiency. Generally, at least 2 diopter less than the minimum amplitude of accommodation for the age is considered accommodation insufficiency. Now let's see what are the clinical features of accommodation insufficiency. Symptoms: difficulty in near work but comfortable at distance, gradually blurring of vision, discomfort and eye strain associated with near task, heaviness of eyelid associated with near task, difficulty with attention and concentration while reading. Now, what are the signs of accommodation insufficiency? 1. Amplitude of accommodation and near point of accommodation. Amplitude of accommodation will be low and near point of accommodation will be receded or goes away from the patient. 2. Monocular accommodative facility. In monocular accommodative facility, patient will face difficulty in clearing minus lens. 3. Binocular accommodative facility. In binocular accommodative facility, patients will face difficulty in clearing minus lens. 4. Negative relative accommodation. In negative relative accommodation, patient will accept high plus, so negative relative accommodation will be high. 5. Positive relative accommodation. In positive relative accommodation, patients will have difficulty in clearing minus lens, so positive relative accommodation will be low. 6. Monocular estimated method. In monocular estimated method, there will be lag of accommodation, so it will be high, generally more than 0.75 diopter. Remember, in accommodation insufficiency, patient will have difficulty in clearing minus lens. Now you might be thinking, why does accommodation insufficiency have difficulty in clearing minus lens? Let's see in the next slide. Why minus lens difficulty in accommodation insufficiency? As we already know, in accommodation insufficiency, near point of accommodation receded or goes further away from the patient. When a minus 1.5 diopter lens is introduced, it shifts the rays behind the retina. To bring the rays on the retina, patient needs 1.5 diopter of accommodation, but patient already has insufficiency of accommodation. So, introducing a minus lens in accommodative insufficiency may blur the image. Thus, in accommodative facility and positive relative accommodation, patients with accommodation insufficiency face difficulty to clear minus lens. Now, let's see management plan for accommodation insufficiency. Non-strabismic binocular anomalies management plan divided into following categories: 1. Refractive correction, 2. Added lens power, 3. Prism, 4. Occlusion therapy, 5. Vision therapy, and 6. Surgery. Let's see what are the protocol for accommodation insufficiency. Refractive correction. Always refractive correction should be given. Added plus lens. Yes, it's an important option and should be given. Prism. No prism is given in any accommodative anomalies. Occlusion therapy. No occlusion therapy is given in any accommodative anomalies. Vision therapy. Vision therapy is secondary if symptoms not improve with plus lens. Surgery. No surgery is advised in any accommodative anomalies. So, overall accommodation insufficiency management plan includes 1. Refractive correction, 2. Added plus lens, 3. Vision therapy. Let's see how to give correction in accommodation insufficiency and how to detect added plus lens power. How to give refractive correction in accommodation insufficiency. Accommodation insufficiency mostly associated with myopia. Due to increased total converging power of our eyes, patient can see clear even without using accommodation. Thus, in uncorrected myopia or undercorrected myopia, patients may develop accommodation insufficiency. To correct the myopia, we can give full correction or follow minimum minus and maximum vision. But the point to be remembered is, when we correct myopia, suddenly eyes needs accommodation to work more to focus rays on the retina. As accommodation is insufficient, accommodation can't fulfill the new demand of accommodation and patient face difficulty with near task with myopic correction. Thus, giving a plus lens in accommodation insufficiency is an important option. But remember, this plus lens is temporary to relieve the symptoms. With time, we need to remove the plus lens when accommodation back to normal limit. Let's see how to identify the amount of plus power we need to prescribe in accommodation insufficiency in the next slide. How to identify added plus lens power in accommodation insufficiency. The added plus lens power may be determined by different methods. 1. Based on NRA and PRA values. 2. MEM retinoscopy. 3. Based on AC by A ratio. Here we will discuss about how to find added plus power based on NRA and PRA values. A simple formula can be used to identify added plus power. plus power needed equal to NRA minus PRA divided by 2. Remember, numerical difference of NRA and PRA is taken, no plus or minus sign is taken. Suppose NRA is plus 3.5 diopter and PRA is minus 1.5 diopter. So added plus length will be 3.5 minus 1.5 divided by 2 or 2 divided by 2 or 1 diopter. So initially with distance myopic correction we will start with a plus length of 1 diopter. Then with time when accommodation will be normal we have to remove the plus length. Accommodation excess. What is accommodation excess? When eyes exert more accommodation than required is called accommodation excess. In accommodation excess, accommodative response is higher than the accommodative stimulus. Suppose at 40 cm, accommodative stimulus is 2.5 diopter, but in accommodation excess, accommodative response will be more than 2.5 diopter. Accommodation excess is more common in the condition where rays focus behind the retina, like hyperopia, overcorrected myopia, undercorrected hyperopia. Now let's see what are the clinical features of accommodation excess. Symptoms: blurred distance vision more prominent after near work, headache and eye strain after short period of reading, difficulty focusing from far to near, sensitivity to light. These symptoms are more prominent towards the end of the day because at the beginning of the day we are energetic and by the time our body becomes tired and can't exert the extra accommodation. Now let's see what are the signs of accommodative excess. 1. Amplitude of accommodation and near point of accommodation. Amplitude of accommodation will be high and near point of accommodation will be closer. 2. Monocular accommodative facility. In monocular accommodative facility, patient will facing difficulty in clearing plus lens. 3. Binocular accommodative facility. In binocular accommodative facility also, patient will face difficulty in clearing plus lens. 4. Positive relative accommodation. In positive relative accommodation, patient will accept more minus. It will be high. 5. Negative relative accommodation. In negative relative accommodation, patient will facing difficulty in clearing plus lens, so it will be low. 6. Monocular estimated method. In monocular estimated method, there will be lead of accommodation or low MEM value. Remember, in accommodation excess, patient will have difficulty in clearing plus lens. Now you might be thinking, why does accommodative excess have difficulty in clearing plus lens? Let's see in the next slide. Why plus lens difficulty in accommodation excess? In accommodation excess, near point of accommodation come closer. When a plus 1.5 diopter lens is introduced, it shifts the rays in front of the retina. To bring the rays on the retina, patient needs to relax 1.5 diopter of accommodation. But as patient has accommodation excess, it can't relax the required amount of accommodation and make the image blur. Thus, in accommodative facility and negative relative accommodation, patient with accommodation excess face difficulty to clear plus lens. Now, management plan for accommodation excess. Non-strabismic binocular anomalies management plan divided into following categories. Let's see what are the protocol for accommodative excess management. 1. Refractive correction. Refractive correction should always given in accommodative excess patient. 2. Added plus lens. Added plus lens is not indicated in accommodation excess. 3. Prism. No prism is indicated in any accommodative anomalies. 4. Occlusion therapy. No occlusion therapy is indicated in any accommodative anomalies. 5. Vision therapy. Vision therapy is primary treatment option for accommodative excess patient. 6. Surgery. No surgery is indicated in any accommodative anomalies. So, overall, the management of accommodation excess include 1. Refractive correction, 2. Vision therapy. Now let's see how to give correction in accommodation excess patient. How to give refractive correction in accommodation excess patient. Accommodation access mostly associated with hyperopia. In hyperopia, the total converging power of eyes is decreased and rays coming from infinitive focus behind the retina. When rays focus behind the retina, accommodation gets stimulated and bring back the rays on the retina. But as accommodation has to work more than the required to bring the rays on the retina, ultimately it ends up with accommodative access. To correct hyperopia, we can follow maximum plus for maximum vision. But remember, in hyperopia, eye accommodates for both near and distance. That means when we are doing refraction of a hyperopic patient, accommodation is already activated. So some amount of hyperopia is already corrected by accommodation when we are doing refraction. Suppose a patient is having plus 5 diopter of hyperopia, but we may find plus 3 diopter of hyperopia in a refraction and plus 2 diopter may corrected by accommodation. So when we will place a plus 3 diopter lens in the trial frame, patient will read 6 by 6 line, though the actual power is plus 5 diopter. Thus, in accommodation access, always better to do cycloplegic refraction or fogging for the final prescription. Accommodative infacility. In accommodative infacility, patient can't facilitate accommodation demand for different accommodative stimulation. Patient experiences difficulty changing the accommodative response level, like changing accommodation from near to distance or changing accommodation from distance to near. Eyes can't produce required amount of accommodative demand to an accommodative stimulus. Generally, from near to far, we need 0.56 second to respond to an accommodative stimulus. From distance to near, we need 0.64 second to respond to an accommodative stimulus. But in accommodation infacility, it requires more time to respond to accommodative stimulus than required. In accommodation infacility, amplitude of accommodation is normal, but patient's ability to use required amount of accommodation quickly and for long periods of time is inadequate. So, as an optometrist, if you check only amplitude of accommodation, you may miss the diagnosis of accommodation infacility. The tests that can specifically diagnose accommodative infacility are negative relative accommodation, positive relative accommodation, monocular accommodative facility, and binocular accommodative facility. Now let's see what are the symptoms of accommodative infacility. Most symptoms are associated with reading or other close work. Common complaints are difficulty changing focus from one distance to another, blurred vision, headache, eye strain, difficulty in sustaining and attending to reading or other close work, fatigue. The most characteristic symptom of accommodative infacility is difficulty changing focus from one distance to another. Sign of accommodative infacility. Amplitude and near point of accommodation. Amplitude of accommodation will be normal and near point of accommodation will be also normal. Monocular accommodative facility. Less cycle, difficulty in clearing both plus and minus lens. Binocular accommodative facility, less cycle due to difficulty in clearing both plus and minus lens. Diagnosis not finalized with less number of cycle rather than less number of cycle due to difficulty in clearing both plus and minus lens. Like a low number of cycle in monocular and binocular facility may be due to clearing in plus lens but normal with minus lens, or difficulty in minus lens but normal with plus lens. So in accommodative infacility, the number of cycle will be less but due to difficulty in clearing both plus and minus lens, not only plus, not only minus. For negative relative accommodation, negative relative accommodation will be low due to difficulty in clearing plus lens. 5. Positive relative accommodation. Positive relative accommodation will also low due to difficulty in minus lens. 6. Monocular estimated method. It will be normal plus 0.25 to plus 0.75 diopter. Remember, tests that require to relax or stimulation of accommodation will be reduced in accommodation infacility, like accommodative facility, relative accommodation. Esophoria at near is most common binocular vision problem associated with accommodative infacility, although exophoria and even intermittent exophoria have been reported. Now let's see management plan for accommodation in facility. Non-strabismic binocular anomalies management plan can be divided into following categories. Let's see what are the protocol for accommodative in facility. Refractive correction. Refractive correction should always be given in accommodative in facility. Added plus lens, not recommended. Prism, no prism in any accommodative anomalies. Occlusion therapy, no occlusion therapy in any accommodative anomalies. Vision therapy. Vision therapy is primary treatment option for accommodative in facility. Surgery. No surgery is indicated in any accommodative anomalies. So the management plan for accommodative in facilities are 1. Refractive correction, 2. Vision therapy. Now therapies for accommodation in facility. Though computer-based exercises has higher outcome, due to their expensiveness it is not possible to perform. Simple manual exercises are lens sorting, loose lens rock, brook string, heart chart, accommodative flipper, bug in the string, barrel card exercise. The purpose of these exercises are to improve the accommodative response. I will cover each of these exercises in a separate video. Till then, stay with smart optometry and study optometry smartly.